The turn of the millennium was a whole new era for Sonic the Hedgehog. Sega's newest console, the Dreamcast, was in full swing. Sonic Adventure was met with critical acclaim, and it was the console's most popular game. That's pretty amazing when you consider that the mainline Sonic games took a break for half a decade. So just like the decade prior, getting a sequel out the door, and fast, was a no-brainer. Unfortunately, Sega's troublesome past caught up with them, and in early 2001, they announced that they'd soon exit the console market and cease production on the Dreamcast. Sonic Team was still deep into development on their follow-up for Sonic Adventure, so ultimately, Sega decided to go out on a high note. And oh boy, what a high note it was, because half a year later on June 19, 2001, Sonic Adventure 2 was released as a swan song for the Dreamcast. And the Sonic franchise hasn't been the same since. It expanded Sonic's world in so many ways, and its breakout character, Shadow the Hedgehog, single-handedly changed the roadmap of the series for about the next half-decade. Shadow has left such a strong impression on me since his debut, so it's pretty surreal seeing him get such an incredible focus over 2 decades later with Sonic X Shadow Generations and the highly anticipated Sonic Movie 3. 2024 has been an incredibly busy year for the Sonic franchise, but let's be real, this year doesn't belong to Sonic. After all, it is colloquially known as the Year of Shadow for a reason. How did we get to this point though? Why is Shadow not only so successful, but how is he able to rival Sonic in terms of popularity? Who is Shadow exactly, and what does his character stand for? I'll do my best to answer that and more. This is my breakdown of Shadow the Hedgehog. Before I get started, I want to take a moment to thank my channel members. This video's shoutout goes to SNES. Thank you so much for being such a cool dude and a great friend. Man, I'll never forget the bag of hot Cheetos you brought to my Sonic Revolution table. And if you'd like to have your name featured here and have a possible shout out, please consider becoming a member by hitting the join button. Also, a huge thank you to my patrons too. The support means a lot and it allows me to keep creating content. And without further ado, let's get back to the video. Sonic is no stranger to having rivals. Before Shadow came along, there was Metal Sonic who debuted in Sonic CD, and Knuckles the Echidna soon after in Sonic 3. Metal Sonic was made in Sonic's image, and Knuckles' abilities and color were in stark contrast with Sonic's. Both of these made for great rivals, but neither of them really stuck the landing over time. In the same title that Knuckles debuted in, he became Sonic's friend, and after Metal Sonic's debut, he sort of just got reduced to background character fodder. Womp womp. When Sonic Adventure 2 came out, Sonic Team took the best qualities of 90s Knuckles and Metal Sonic and combined them into one character. Shadow had that same kind of edge Metal Sonic had, and he also had a similar contrast as Knuckles. Sure, Shadow has a similar appearance to Sonic and even has some of the same abilities, but in-game, this was purely coincidental, rather than intentional, like in the case of Metal Sonic. Some of Shadow's new powers weren't just brute strength like Knuckles, but rather tied to the Chaos Emeralds. His new powers were fresh, and most importantly, unique. This, along with his design, was striking too. His quills are somewhat shaped like Supersonic's, especially in the Dreamcast era, and his red markings are inspired by makeup worn by actors in kabuki theater too. On paper, he looks like Sonic, but evil. But there was much, much more to him than that. So, unlike Knuckles and Metal Sonic, I think Shadow was the third rival for Sonic attempt that stuck with time. If you were to ask anyone in the 90s who Sonic's rival was, they'd no doubt say Knuckles. And ever since 2001, it's definitely been Shadow, and for good reason. I think it's safe to say that Shadow is arguably one of the most recognizable Sonic characters, especially in recent years with him being used so frequently in memes. But for those of you who might not know too much about him, let's break down the character. Shadow is a synthetic being, created half a century ago in the Space Colony arc by the genius Dr. Gerald Robotnik. In collaboration with the evil extraterrestrial entity, Black Doom, they hope to create the ultimate life form. The purpose of Shadow's creation, titled Project Shadow, was to help Gerald Robotnik get closer to finding the cure to saving his granddaughter Maria from a terminal illness. After Shadow formed a close bond with Maria, she, along with everyone else on the Ark involved in Shadow's creation, were murdered in a raid by the Guardian Units of Nations, or GUN for short. This is because once the government caught wind that Gerald Robotnik was collaborating with the evil Black Doom, they felt that Gerald and his creation couldn't be trusted. Before Maria was murdered right in front of Shadow, she helped him escape the Ark in a space pod, but it was ultimately intercepted by Gunn, who put him into stasis. While Shadow was suspended in animation, Gerald Robotnik continued to work under a very close eye of the overseeing government, up until his execution. During this time, Gerald learned of the murder of Maria by the hands of the government that he was working for. Knowing that he was working for the very entity that murdered his granddaughter, he began to lose hope in humanity, and he ultimately lost his mind, which left him bloodthirsty for revenge. He modified Shadow's memories in an act of retaliation, which basically soft reprogrammed Shadow to want to destroy humanity. Gerald was then executed after his downward spiral, and Shadow then remained suspended in animation for 50 years. That is until Gerald's grandson, Ivo Robotnik, would discover Shadow and reawaken him. Seeing as Shadow's memories were artificially altered, Shadow was very willing to assist Dr. Robotnik in his nefarious endeavors. Maria's final moments kept replaying in his head, effectively traumatizing him, and was a constant fuel for his anger toward humanity, who he then pledged to take revenge on. He then meets Rouge the Bat, who also allied herself with Dr. Robotnik for her own reasons. Then, after Shadow committed a series of crimes, Sonic was then incarcerated and held responsible for Shadow's actions. Sonic eventually escapes and encounters Shadow. This is when Sonic quickly puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that there is an identity mix-up. So, Sonic wanted to put an end to it, but was seemingly outmatched as Shadow used a new technique with the power of the Chaos Emeralds called Chaos Control. Sonic, who wanted to protect humanity, and Shadow, who wanted to destroy it, clashed several times after this. Eventually, though, with the help of Amy Rose, Shadow begins to remember that Maria wanted Shadow to assist humanity, not destroy it. Upon realizing that Shadow fucked up, he quickly flipped sides, joining Sonic in the final battle against the prototype of the ultimate life form, the Bio-Lizard. After Shadow defeated it on his own, it was a sore loser, and in a last-ditch effort, it grotesquely fused itself with the Ark so it could pilot itself towards Earth and destroy it. Sonic and Shadow then harnessed the power of the Chaos Emeralds together and defeated the prototype of the ultimate life form in the nick of time, but Shadow ran out of energy and plummeted through Earth's atmosphere, bringing him to his end. He died with dignity, as he fulfilled Maria's wish of saving humanity. He may have been manipulated, but his resolve didn't falter. The only thing that changed was him realizing what his mission truly was. This brought his story full circle, as he was then reunited with Maria in the afterlife, and Sonic Adventure 2's credits rolled. And just like that, Shadow's tale had been concluded, and would go down in Sonic history as a hero. Except until the very next game, Sonic Heroes, released. At the very beginning of the story for Sonic Heroes, Rouge successfully breaks into Robotnik's base to find his secret treasure, but instead she finds Shadow, alive. And this is where things get complicated. She then drains his pod full of Nickelodeon slime and Shadow wakes up, saving her from an attack from one of Robotnik's guard robots named E123 Omega. Eventually, Rouge manages to quell Shadow and Omega's brief duel, and then begins to pick their brains a bit. Shadow can't remember anything that happened. He doesn't know who the hell he even is. And having worked with Shadow in the last title, Rouge saw him as a friend and wanted to help him recover his memories. But the only way to do that was to beat it out of Dr. Robotnik, who is fully known by Dr. Eggman at this point. Rouge suggests that the 3 of them team up. Her, Shadow, and the new E123 Omega, who wants revenge on Eggman since he didn't like how he was being treated. From that point on, the 3 of them formed Team Dark, and then went on to battle Dr. Eggman. By the end of Sonic Heroes, it's revealed that there are many robotic Shadow doppelgangers running around, which made Rouge question whether or not the Shadow that she and Omega have been spending time with was the real one, or just an android. Sonic Heroes ends on this bizarre cliffhanger, but it's quickly picked up in the 2005 spin-off title, Shadow the Hedgehog. In this game, he meets Black Doom, the entity that Gerald Robotnik worked with to create Shadow. Specifically, it was Black Doom's DNA that was used to help create him, which is why Gunn deemed Shadow to be such a threat. Throughout this title, Shadow is caught in the middle of a game of tug-of-war between Black Doom and Sonic's friends, and after learning more about Black Doom and his plans, he decides he doesn't want to work with him and defeats him. Shadow then decides that, despite his past, it was time for him to put it behind him and move on, and ultimately stay true to who he is as an individual. This character arc for Shadow is one of the most complex backstories in the entire history of the Sonic franchise. As a kid, and even now, I'm really impressed with the complexity and heart that these games had. Sure, the execution of these games get a little messier as time goes on, but I can't lie. It's some of the most ambitious storytelling Sonic games have ever had, in my opinion, even if it fumbles the bag more often than it should. And because of this messy storytelling, it makes realizing who Shadow is and what he stands for a bit difficult to define. One could say that it's purposefully meant to be ambiguous, but fans and even higher-ups at Sega all seem to have their own idea of who Shadow is at his core. Let me explain. Takashi Iizuka, head of Sonic Team, recently said that Shadow is actually not Sonic's friend. Hell, Shadow isn't even friends with Rouge and Omega, apparently. Shadow is a lone wolf who acts completely out of self-interest. Sometimes he'll team up with Sonic, and sometimes he'll team up with Eggman. It all depends on what Shadow wants. Many fans, including myself, will argue that while Shadow prefers to work by himself, he does actually have friends. Good friends, in fact. The chemistry that he has with Sonic, and especially Rouge and Omega, all attest to this. And more often than not, Shadow's alignment has been mostly good rather than bad. So, what gives? Surely, Iizuka must know what he's talking about, given that he's the head of Sonic Team and he's been a consistent veteran of the series since Sonic the Hedgehog 3 began development in 1993. Given Shadow's current depiction, what Iizuka had to say about him, though, isn't technically wrong. Ever since 2010 kicked off the meta era of games, the Sonic cast's personalities got a soft reset, and many of them became flanderized, especially ones who didn't really have the spotlight and were sort of just kept to background characters. Basically, they took the most recognizable aspects of each character's personality and turned it up to 11. Shadow hasn't really showed up too much in the meta era to really demonstrate a huge noticeable change, but there definitely are some small things. Shadow, in my opinion, almost always seems kinda grumpy, and before this he was kind of just quiet, but now he seems to purposefully antagonize Sonic. I always saw it as just two friends sort of just teasing each other, but Iizuka literally said that Shadow is not friends with Sonic. And if you can't tell by now, this is the bit that bugs me the most. I get that Shadow is a loner, but why can't he have friends? The dude has a heart. That much is obvious, given that his arc is pretty much driven by trauma for losing someone near and dear to him. So why would Iizuka double down on Shadow not considering Sonic a friend, but Rouge and Omega as well? Personally, I think it was a poor choice of words. Iizuka is asked questions on the fly, and his answers are often stated without much thought. And that's what we as the fanbase are kinda left to chew on. I realize that I may be thinking a bit too deeply into this, because at the end of the day, Sega's gonna do what they want with Shadow and the rest of these characters anyway. But honestly, I can't help it. Sonic the Hedgehog has meant a lot to me for 3 decades now, and its characters, while never truly consistent, have always been near and dear to me. Their depictions in the official source material does matter, just like the gameplay matters. The way all of this intertwined material is handled usually has a huge sway on how the series is perceived and how well it does financially. If people didn't love these characters, then it wouldn't be worth making so many action figures, plush dolls, and other merchandise of their likeliness. Especially now, when merchandise has become such a large part of Sonic's financial well-being, and let's be real, it's probably the largest right now, it's important to emphasize the rest of the fan-favorite characters. So, what's my point here? My point is that when Iizuka says things like, Shadow doesn't have any friends, it's more of a casual conversation that he's having rather than a definitive guide. He may be on the mark sometimes, but I firmly believe that the material contradicts statements like this. I just can't see him not being friends with Rouge and Omega, and at least see Sonic as some kind of friendly associate. In Sonic Adventure 2, Sonic Heroes, and Sonic 06, Shadow has been more than willing to work with others, as long as their values match his. Rouge has been the most consistent character he's worked with on several occasions, so I'd consider her to be the one closest to him, and probably his best friend. The narrative that's pushed is that Shadow is a complete loner. But just because you're a loner, it doesn't mean that you can't have any friends. You can still have friends and choose to work by yourself. So where did this idea that Shadow is a lone wolf even come from? Personally, I believe it comes from Shadow not subscribing to labels. He wants to fight for the Earth, but his idea of justice may differ from the way a character like Sonic may choose to handle it. Look at his portrayal in Sonic X. When he finds out that Cosmo was being used as a spy for the Metarex, the only way to eliminate the threat was to kill her. Shadow and the rest of the heroes shared a similar enemy, but Shadow wasn't willing to fuck around here. Even though the other characters like Sonic and especially Tails frowned upon his approach here, I'm sure deep down Shadow didn't want to do it, seeing as he's all too familiar with the person most important to him being taken away from him in cold blood. It's like Shadow knew that he had to be the one to take this burden on himself because the others weren't strong enough to do it. Shadow had a very no bullshit approach, and I think that's what Izuka means when he says that Shadow's a loner, and essentially an anti-hero or someone who's just completely neutral. His heart is in the right place, and he feels strongly about achieving justice, and he will happily work alongside those that agree with him, and because he wants to do what's best for the Earth, that's why it seems like it's always Sonic that he's aligning with. Like Sonic, he's free like the wind, but Shadow's wind is more like a storm. Angry and unpredictable. Sonic is a pretty steadfast character, sure, but he's undoubtedly gentler and more open-minded towards his friends. Meanwhile, Shadow isn't really willing to let others sway him. Not anymore. He's had enough of that. He's vowed to be straight to the point and has absolute zero patience for nonsense. Even if he has a similar goal as his allies, he opts to be stubborn and stick to his own plan. You're either with him or without him. If the world chooses to become my enemy, I will fight like I always have. This has to be my favorite quote from Shadow. It perfectly summarizes who he is. He doesn't care about being seen as a hero or an anti-hero or a villain. Those are just labels, useless words that don't have the same kind of impact that his actions do. It means nothing to him. What he does care about is making sure the Earth is protected in his own special way. He does have others who he values, that much is certain, but above anything else, he values the role that he was assigned from birth, which is to be the ultimate life form. What does that even mean anyway? What is the ultimate life form? I think it means that, whether he asked for it or not, he was blessed with powers and abilities that were designed to save and heal. When he couldn't help cure Maria of her illness, he questioned whether or not his existence was even justified. He truly believes that his purpose is to do the right thing. He's had enough trauma and pain from others telling him what to do. So now, in order to be truly liberated from that pain and trauma, he must put his past behind him and let his heart be his compass. And if he ends up being wrong for whatever reason, that's his burden to bear, and nobody else's. After the Adventure era and Sonic 06, there really hasn't been too much for Shadow to do, as characters that aren't Sonic, Tails, and Eggman have taken a huge backseat. I need to mention that I still have yet to read IDW, and I haven't really seen anything beyond Season 1 of Sonic Prime, because honestly, I didn't really care for what I saw. I know lots of people really like Shadow's interpretation in Season 2, and even if they don't care too much for Prime like me, I'm just in no rush to watch it yet. Once I do, or if I do, I'll probably make a video on it or something. It's a good thing it seems like they got his character right though, because if it's not clear yet, I don't think it's easy to write Shadow. His character walks a delicate balance of edge and cool, and if he teetered too much to one side, it can end up being really cringy. But when Shadow's writing is done justice, he's almost always a fan favorite. I think this is why Shadow has stood the test of time. He's so versatile, and I'm glad 2024 seems like it's going to be an incredibly kind year to him, because in my opinion, I think he's been so underused. His complexity makes him one of the most appealing Sonic characters there is, and whether he's the hero, villain, or anti-hero, he's always gonna do what he feels is right, even if those close to him disagree with his approach. He will always have himself to believe in if nobody else does, and that is what truly makes him such a beloved badass. So now that I've rambled on and on about Shadow, what do you think of him? Do you prefer him portrayed as a hero, an anti-hero, or a villain? What about Sonic Movie 3? Are you excited for that one? Make sure you let me know down below in the comments, and I'll be seeing you guys next time. Also, just as a heads up, I have a review of Sonic X Shadow Generations coming out on my Mugi Mikey channel real soon. Subscribe there too if you haven't already. Once it's done, I'll be sure to link it here at the end. Matinee!